You're listening to Fellow Travelers with East of Moon. Welcome to Fellow Travelers, a podcast from East of Moon. We are an organisation that studies, experiments with and develops the ways in which communities create together. My name is Josiane Gatens, and for this episode I was joined by Atli Freyr Hjaltason, a folklorist and ethnologist who is deeply embedded in the folk dancing community in Iceland and beyond. Atli had many things to say about how he sees traditional and folk communities existing in a modern context, and our discussion covered everything from values, identity, social media, and accordions. Atli, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start right at the beginning by talking about your kind of personal journey and inspiration. Wondering if you could just share with us what initially drew you to the field of folklore and ethnology and your own background in folk dancing in particular.
My parents didn't really travel abroad with their children when I was young. So we would occasionally go to my grandparents and stay there for a few days. And when I was little, I was brought into sort of children's baby group in folk dancing that I have no recollection of. But at a later date, don't remember how old I was brought again. They had tried to launch a children's group a few times with various success. And the last time I attended, or the first time I attended a group like that, my grandmother sort of spilled the beans that there was a trip to Denmark. And I was very interested in going to Denmark and was ready to do almost anything to go abroad. So I started attending folk dancing as a kid in a small dance group of maybe 14 kids, ages 6 to 13 maybe. And when we went to Denmark, we went to this festival in Skua in Denmark. I don't remember how many people were there, but most likely above 1,000.
And okay, so big.
Yeah, relatively, but there were people from 9 sort of culture groups there as well. So it's not a lot of people from Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Swedish-speaking Finland as well, and the Åland Islands. So it's a big pool of people to bring people from. And at this festival, I was introduced to a very large sort of, or a big-scale culture movement that was very, I'm not going to say well-funded, but it had people that were very enthusiastic and could create a very positive atmosphere. To be honest, that was not the same atmosphere as at home, but 2 or 3 years later, we hosted the next children's festival.
Okay.
And the fall after that first summer, I was already invited to go with my grandparents to dance with the seniors, seniors as in older dancers. They were not all seniors then, most of them, but not all. So then I was 12 years old when I was the only child sort of attending the grown-up dances as well. I don't understand why or how they tolerated me being there, but they did, and I'm very grateful for that. So since 2010-11, I've been dancing at least once a week, but most of the time 2 to 3 times a week with the Reykjavík Folk Dance Association, Þjóðdansafélag Reykjavíkur, and attending events in the summers in the various Nordic countries, as well as performing for tourists and conferences in Iceland with the performance troupe of the Folk Dance Association. But that was not something I thought about studying or as a career in any way. It was something that I had a few friends that were doing with me, and something I did with my grandparents once a week with them, and then the children's group. Yeah, so when I go to college, I took a lot of courses in psychology, philosophy, history, and was thinking about studying psychology until my teacher told me, you should not study psychology because the things you're interested in are not the things they're teaching at the university. So you should much rather look into sociology or something that studies culture and people rather than sort of math, because math is not my strong suit.
Oh, I can join you on that one.
And I'm also have always, or since I was a child, studied classical guitar, and I was taking a little bit of singing lessons on the side at the music school. And my singing teacher invited me to this modern opera, contemporary opera that they were setting up called Einvaldsóður, which I attended. It was the most difficult piece of music I've ever had to sit through. And I think the author would be proud to hear that as well. It was a very, very challenging piece of work. And there I met this man who I later found out was very hungover when I went to speak to him. And he told me that I should, I was asking him about folk music and he essentially said, you should just go study folklore at the university. So I went home and applied to study folklore at the University of Iceland.
Was he a folklorist?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah. I don't know if he told me that, but that's funny. You know him, Pétur Húni. I didn't know him at all.
Okay.
But he just said this to me, this sort of bearded man, and I just obeyed.
Wise, wisdom-based, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I started studying ethnology and folkloristics. And through my studies, I sort of found out that folk dance and traditions and heritage and music and costumes and all of these things were some things that I could sort of focus on. And I wrote my bachelor's thesis on folk dance, and then I went into my master's and have been studying folk dancing and music and sort of identities and a lot of different aspects of the field. And that sort of has grew into a career of sorts. Yeah, I think that sort of covers my my origins.
It's always good to have the origin story to set the tone. But you got into this essentially through your grandparents, and then I imagine they're there with their friends, and then you've met a lot of friends and people through this as well. What was your experience like in those kind of early days of how aware were you of the community around this dancing? Because there's lots of cultural behaviors that we engage in that have communities around them, and there's a lot that don't also, or maybe they have more explicit or implicit communities. If you go dancing downtown on a Friday night, you might be in a room full of people who have a shared sense of what they want to be doing, and that's a community of sorts as well. But it's very different from a group of people who decide to meet up every week and do the same thing and build social bonds around that. How did you experience that as a young person getting involved?
As a child,
yeah.
I don't think I had any thoughts on the sort of society but I will say that, there were a lot of older people doing this, and a lot of seniors. And when traveling and meeting other young people, young kids, teens, young adults at these festivals, they all had the same sort of perspective from their backgrounds, that they were a small group of young people in a scene of with a very high average age. But when we come together, 2,000 young people in all of the Nordic countries, then it's a big group. Mm-hmm. And a group that has a lot of things in common. One thing that has always been difficult in these settings is that they don't allow English. So we did speak English, but it was very encouraged to try to speak, Danish, Swedish, or Norwegian, or what they call the Nordic languages, leaving out Finnish, Greenlandic, Icelandic, Faroese, and a lot of dialects that people have a hard time understanding. And for me, it was sort of because of this Nordic friend group of sorts that I met for these 2 weeks every year. And then I'm born in 1999, so I had Snapchat and Instagram and all of these. So you could always sort of keep in touch. It was almost like having friends in another school, And then there were, as I grew older, more and more projects that I could partake in and travel more and meet them more often. And then we could sort of go and visit each other for weekends. So for me, we were unified in a way through this sort of feeling of definitely practicing a hobby that was not practiced by young people, but having the sort of group above us that were then my age now, in their 30s, plus minus, that were sort of being semi-professional and doing stuff and putting it on YouTube and publishing albums. And so we had these clear sort of people that we could look up to that weren't like 40, 50 years older than us. Regarding the being in Iceland part of it, the folk dancing scene is a very peculiar scene because There are essentially now 3 dance groups in Iceland, or 1 dance association and 2 performance groups.
Right.
And they don't work together. And there is beef, or what is a more formal way to, there's bad blood.
Yeah. Of course it's very serious, but also it's like really fun to imagine folk dancing beef.
Yeah.
But how does that not working together, that must have a big impact on the functionality of having a thriving scene.
Yeah, it's a very dysfunctional scene for sure. And it's also something that has a very long history, a history that can be stretched almost 100 years back in time. But before we get to that all, while belonging to a scene that doesn't work together and is very split, there were also very connected scenes, like the Kvæðamannafélagið Iðunn, which I never know how to translate into English, the traditional poetry and singing association. They work with the song traditions, but a lot of the later folk dance choreographies and dances are imagined through the song traditions. So you're essentially learning the songs and learning the poems and everything, and also dance choreographies to them. So there is a clear connection there, and previous collaboration also between associations. And then you have the accordion enthusiasts, which is a great scene of people who love accordions. And they really, really, really love accordions, and they love everything about the instrument. It's the best instrument in the world. It doesn't matter if you play classical or jazz or folk accordion. It's all about accordions. And they dance what we call the old dances, which are polkas and reels and waltzes, or what everybody else would call folk dances. So the folk dancers dance that, and also some song dances and imagined choreographies of some ideas on a dance lost to time, and some very interesting, weird stuff. But as a folk dancer, you sort of belong in both worlds. And in the folk dancing scene, you maybe learn more variations and more sort of technique, and there's more thought behind dancing, while if you're in the accordion scene, you're dancing because the accordions are playing the dancing music, and you're not thinking about the dance, you're just dancing because there's an accordion playing. And so there were like one big common event a year. So that's another scene that's very, very closely connected. And then we have the handicraft side of things, because when you're performing traditional dances, the person hiring you usually wants you to wear traditional clothing as well. And then we're connected into the scene of people who like to create folk costumes and handicraft and more. So by being in this one scene, you are very connected. There's a very easy sort of way to communicate with these different scenes. There's no need to go between, but there are very clear connections. So I don't know how to answer your question. It was very complicated. And also meeting these people that were in one scene, and then there was this other scene, and to me they are a part of the same thing, but those people do not associate with each other at all. And there is no common grounds, and I would go abroad and it would be presented as one.
Right.
There as well, like we were sort of taking a little bit from everybody and sort of using this folk label in a wider context than just focusing on singing, or just focusing on the instrument, or just focusing on the clothes. Because for us as performers on stage, we're not going to perform naked. That's not the tradition. And we're not going to perform in silence. That's not the tradition either. And so for me, I think there is a big difference coming from a scene that is looking in every direction rather than a scene that is looking inwards constantly. There was also a lot of looking inwards, but it's important to sort of have both. But this also makes it very difficult to communicate with people who come from backgrounds where they are the center of the universe and there is nothing else and there is nothing more holy, and there is no sort of perspective that, you approach somebody and you know that they have something important to tell and important to them. And it's very easy to understand because I come from a background that welcomes that perspective. Also by, being very invested in Nordic festivals and events where you're always meeting people who bring their nation's culture in, and we are bringing ours, and it isn't any fun if I'm just going to Denmark to be alone in a corner doing my thing with my friends. And you try to mingle and you try to experience something new and do something together and figure out where where you can do something, we can dance these dances together because we have the same dance in our countries, and then we have some dances they don't, and vice versa. So we learn both of them, and suddenly sort of this, is it called like a pidgin language? No.
Yes.
Yeah. So you learn like, you're not an expert or you're not very fluent, but you can make it work.
Yeah.
So I think that regarding your original question, I think that I was very aware of these aspects even as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And as a young adult, it's very frustrating because sort of always trying to bring people into events and trying to sort of connect people and trying to make people work together. Yeah, you're trying to bring people together and trying to make the whole environment make sense. But the way things have been in Iceland is that people are generally very focused on their sort of little subculture.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point, and also because this is something that you are specifically focusing on now. You're kind of developing from this role of having been brought into this world of folk arts and folk culture and folk dancing, and specifically that you have moved through that to now being a bit of a kind of community leader yourself in these areas. So now you're taking on some of the responsibility for bridging these gaps between these different niche communities to make a slightly less niche community, perhaps, a more contextualized space for all of these, whether you're an accordion enthusiast or a handicrafter, or trying to make this more holistic idea of what folk culture in Iceland looks like. And something that I think is also relevant that you bring up this these through lines of folk tradition and folk culture, because there are certain aspects of a folk community that might be quite different than communities based around other activities. And one of them is this intergenerational thing, where it's very frequent that as we participate in traditions that are predominantly handed down from one older person to one younger person, that we're very versed in that language of communication and way of spending time together. As a community leader now, if we want to call it that, how are you working in this intergenerational way? How are you facilitating knowledge exchange between older generations and young people who you're trying to bring into the scene who may not have the same context and knowledge or have grown up with these traditions?
So to sort of talk myself into the answer, since sort of getting a job and having an income, I have made a point of being a member of every association, not in the country, but around me, that is connected to folk culture in any way. And I will also say that despite mentioning the accordion scene, the traditional singing and poetry scene, and the handicraft scene and the folk dancing scene, that is by no means a defining group of items that are limited or exclusive as folk culture. Everything can be considered folk culture or traditional culture. It's a very relative term, But there is still some conversation to be had about, where do we draw the line and why, and what is heritage, and, should we talk about wall graffiti in Reykjavik as heritage and folk arts, and does that have any space in this environment of folk dances? And in many ways, yes, and there are many ways we can try to have this conversation. So my approach has very much been through, who has agency and why. And my stance has been that these associations or institutions or groups of people that have a set system of power, you can get voted into a board and you can be there for an X amount of time, and there needs to be some way of navigating the scene where people can get in, and
certain access points for people.
And also certain things in order to define or grapple the thing in question and define it a little bit, so you know what you're dealing with, so people have words to talk about them. And I think that individuals alone aren't really the way to do that. There always needs to be some scene, be it a fan club, that creates a space for talking and for passing on. And suddenly you have, like with Kvæðamannafélagið, that is founded by people who are moving from the countryside to Reykjavik and found this association around the tradition of oral poetic performance. They create the conversation. And now, 90-something years later, the conversation is still going, and it's not defined by any laws other than the laws created by the members who are passing it on. this is a very complicated thing to maneuver, and I think that this is something that used to be much more natural in Iceland. I'm sure that the youth movement was also in Scotland, and I think it came here from Sweden or Norway or Denmark. The whole mindset of the youth movement is what I think created, in a way, all of these associations in Iceland, organizations. I don't know which word to use in English. Félög is the Icelandic word. And I think that when you're raised in this mindset that you are a member and you're a volunteer, and you think, what can I do for the organization, or what can I do for this society or scene? This is something that I don't think is very present today. And people would rather pay a yearly fee and be serviced, is sort of my feeling generally. So when we're trying to expand on these scenes and try to get new people in, there are a few things that sort of strike me. That is that it's very hard to get people to volunteer and be a part of the family, within quotation marks. So people would much rather maybe like to attend a concert and listen to the thing, or attend a workshop in order to become a performer. And I think that there's of course space for ego, but you have to sort of approach it from a scene-oriented way rather than a solo-oriented way. And I think that this is the challenging part of navigating between the older generations now and the younger generations. Because in my experience, the older generations understand these principles that these scenes are built on, while younger people are coming in and they have other demands or other needs and requirements for participation. And the frameworks set in place don't accommodate them. So it's very hard to keep them invested and keep them coming. A lot of the events are free because everybody's just giving their time and expertise and experience. And the idea is that everybody can come and experience it for free, and it's a hassle having to deal with money when nobody's getting paid, and there is nobody getting paid to deal with the money, and there is no system. And I think this is sort of the big challenge, is how do we make this make sense to new people, and how do we welcome them or offer competitive experiences
when there's so much else going on that people can spend their time on.
Yeah, and the quality of it, because people are paying for it.
Yeah.
And how are you going to start suddenly charging people who have been doing something voluntarily and for free for 60 years? Like, how is the change going to happen, and why? And are you going to change the entire script of the scene to maybe cater to a new group of people? Are you going to host a separate event and sort of pull them apart? Or is the intergenerational aspect a strength and a positive thing? In my research, I have noticed an interesting thing that happened with dances in the countryside, at least.
Right.
That people would gather in the winter periodically and dance together, and there you would sort of have your grandparents and your parents and your children and all of your family and the people from the next farm, and you would gather together and everybody would have the same evening entertainment. They would maybe play cards, there would be some singing, there would be some drinking coffee and eating pancakes, there would be some dancing. And then sometime after 1950, bands start to tour, and people start following the bands and attending events, and the modernization of entertainment. And suddenly
this would be like accordion bands, or what kind of
I want to say that this is maybe more Beatles inspired.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is after post Second World War, post Americans in Iceland.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a road system now. And you don't have to sort of travel for 3 hours after you have milked the cows and wait until there is light so you can walk back home to milk the cows again. And suddenly young people are getting together in the summer, when previously you had to sort of mow everything by hand, and there was no time to get together, and partying in the summer was nonsense because you were so busy trying desperately to prepare for winter. And so there becomes this sort of gap between generations. And so this generation that's now born after 1940, they are essentially the generation that sort of isolates themselves in a way. And that's something that hasn't stopped. So I think that these challenges, this is something that's very deeply rooted in the entertainment culture here in Iceland. I have no perspective of any other country, but I suspect that it's very similar, that with better infrastructure and people start traveling more around, and with technology, farming becomes easier, people move to the cities, these things change, and you don't really spend all of your evenings with your parents playing cards anymore. So I think that, the uprooting or trying to get people to sort of join old traditional things and try to get them to practice traditional things in a contemporary context, it doesn't really make sense. And it doesn't really make sense because the topics introduced, be it folk dancing, traditional singing, or, they come from a society that functions in a very different way. And for the folk dancing, what they did was that they started putting it on stage. So you would be a semi-professional folk dancer and you would put on these big performances. And now you wouldn't be dancing Icelandic folk dances in the National Theatre of Iceland because people aren't really interested in that. Or at least there has not been interest for that for some time now. So I don't think there are very clear answers to the challenges. But what I think is happening now is that when the computers and the digital age starts, we sort of move into this period where we're trying to digitize our world. So we declutter and we sort of have everything grey, black and white and sterile around us. And now it seems like people are trying to move away from that again. So you're suddenly seeing these events like speed dating events at bars. And people are trying to attend sort of these, what you would call old school social events. But it's really seeking human connection. And that's where you start to think, maybe we could start to introduce some, traditional themes again, like having dance evenings or trying to help people establish an identity through their region of upbringing rather than desperately clinging on to trends that pass in a week and people can't really figure out where they want to feel comfortable because there is, leather jackets are out now. Now you have to wear denim and denim is out. And so you have to wear, this other thing and you're buying clothes and selling them again and sort of can't really invest your time and money and effort into this one thing. And I think that it becomes exhausting after a while. So there is perhaps a new strategy emerging now with people sort of being extremely overwhelmed with these algorithms that are eating us up through excessive information and trends and the speed of everything. And also, that we can be connected in Iceland with people living in California and Japan at the same time and everything is happening in an instant and we're influenced by these vastly different cultures that are still the same and it's very confusing. So a lot of questions and not really many answers.
I think you hit on some very important points though. And I think, one of them, I really relate to this thing that you're saying about we're seeing this in all kinds of ways, this idea of going back to things for different reasons. So, for instance, we all generally have access to Spotify or Apple Music or something similar, and yet we have seen this massive resurgence in vinyl purchasing, or even cassette tapes are becoming huge again, and things that people were like really excited to leave behind them because they were archaic or seemed clumsy or more inconvenient to use, suddenly their value becomes relevant in a different way. So yes, we still want the convenience of listening to whatever song we feel like as we walk along the street at the snap of a finger, press of a button, but we want the tangible experience of owning a designed, crafted, well thought out album of music that we can hold in our hands. And I think it's very interesting to me that in general, while we have lost a lot of quote-unquote folk and traditional culture and behaviours over the years, and I am being careful and we're using very imprecise language here because that's kind of how it is. These labels they mean various things to various people. But we've lost some of the culture, we can read about it or we know about it, but we don't practice it anymore. And yet some things remain present, kind of despite all odds. So while it might not have the same social function that it may have done, people are not doing Icelandic folk dancing because there's a winter evening and you live on a farm and you want to have the farm next door over and do a thing. It still persists, and there are these amazing experiences where it sometimes feels more relevant than ever. I'm thinking about having attended some of your events or events that you've been involved in. You sometimes run these events in a bar in downtown Reykjavik, these Viki or Saknavaka dances, where rather than being partner dances, it's a big group of people in a circle holding hands and singing. And generally there are kind of easy-ish refrains that even if you don't know the songs, you can get involved in. And they're hugely popular, and they're hugely popular with young people. And we are experiencing a lot of social isolation across generations, particularly affecting older people. But we also, have this experience in Iceland where we have a high number of immigrants living in the country. Where do you think there's an opportunity for folk culture to bridge some of these divides? I guess what is special or unique about these folk traditions? You can use dancing as an example if you like, or any other, as a way of pulling people together who otherwise wouldn't necessarily meet in a room.
So there are a few ways to approach this. In the past few years, I've been trying to get the institution of the Folk Dance Association to host dance courses in collaboration with embassies. We had a course with the Polish embassy, the Norwegian embassy. So there are definitely ways for example, the Folk Dance Association of Reykjavik to not only focus on Icelandic dancing and trying to offer a space for, all folk dance. And in the definition of that association, it's Icelandic folk dance, and collecting it and preserving it or passing it on is definitely a focus, but not solely. Regarding these events, the Sagnavaka events, I had hosted for a few years a predecessor to those events where we essentially did the same thing, but not in a bar. And I had this idea for a while to try to take these ballads, the poems and the songs and what we call the Faroese dance, the Brandle Simple, and put it into a contemporary party context. So in a bar on a Saturday evening downtown, and see what would happen. And then Thorsteinn Björnsson reached out to the Folk Dance Association inquiring about traditional dances. And so I met with him and sort of proposed this idea. And we launched this project, and very soon my brother, Kalle, and then Kári Pálsson came and joined the project. So from the first event, we have been 4. And we sort of had these discussions. I was adamant that we would use, at least to begin with, only traditional melodies. We would sing the ballads in the full length, be it 20, 60, 200 verses. And we would have it on a Saturday. It had to be on a Saturday, and it had to be downtown Reykjavik. And we didn't know what would happen. I was fully expecting a house full of seniors, with their, what is it called? The
walkers.
The walkers, and just sort of attending to just sit and listen, because Icelanders are very difficult to work with. We don't...
You're allowed to say that, I'm not.
But, I'm sure you've had these experiences where you get people and it's a participatory thing, and nobody wants to participate.
Yes.
They just want to watch and listen. And I do this when I attend other people's events, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I feel very uncomfortable being asked to leave my comfort zone. And so we start and, sort of set out with presenting 2 ballads each event for the first months. And, I don't think we have had an event with under 20 people, which is a great success. And
Absolutely.
The biggest one was in the hundreds. We were outside of the bar, out in the street, filled with people. If we count all the spectators that stayed for a while, then it's hundreds of people. Maybe 400, but still hundreds. And
that's a big deal.
Yeah, it's like a 0.0001% of the population or something, and we have had, a sort of a relatively consistent group of people showing up, and we have been fortunate enough to sort of ruin the bar for an evening for free, and we don't get paid. And we also think that it would change if we were sort of paid actors. There are a few things that I have been trying to sneak past, like encouraging people to wear the traditional skotthúfa, the tassel hats. And we have seen people sort of knitting their own hats just for this. And that, for me, the idea behind that is to give people a wearable identity that they can stick in their pocket, so they can come to an event and wear their, I am dancing folk, I have the hat. And then when they leave, if they're embarrassed, they just put it in their purse or doesn't matter. And then, through time, we started wearing full outfits at the National Day and at Christmas and the Reykjavik Culture Night. And it's definitely something that is sort of gaining traction. And it's very fun, but it's also focused on, it's going to be a very controversial thing to say, but it's very focused on literature. And when you approach dance through literature, you're not really putting the dance first, which isn't really a problem, but it's a problem for me. Because this resonates with, when we were trying to fight for our independence and trying to establish the identity of the Icelandic people, of course the sagas are the things that were used. And, we were the people who wrote them, and we are the people who documented things, and we wrote things down. We are poets, we are historians, we are important because we are writers. So when you want to implement this logic to the dance of the Icelanders, you can't really look at the Danish dances that were being danced in Iceland, but they weren't really Danish because they were from Brittany and they were from Scotland and they were from Norway and Denmark, but that didn't really matter. But what they knew was that 100 and something years ago, people danced some kind of dance that nobody ever described, which means that you can't prove that it isn't unique.
Right.
So this idea of these amazing dances that, of course, I'm romanticizing this narration a little bit, but you can't really prove that the dances that were danced to these ballads that we have manuscripts of, they are our true folk dances, because you can't prove that they aren't, And by hosting these events, we are essentially sort of giving a nod to that history, while we have a living tradition that has been here for over 300 years. And it's a wonderful tradition and very rich. And we have instrumental music, and we have songs, and we have poems that have been written to the dance tunes. And I think that is just as valid, and that is still being practiced as a living tradition in the accordion enthusiasts societies that are like 20 across the country. And they have big festivals in the summers where they're dancing those dances, and also rumba and swing, and doesn't matter, it's played on an accordion. But so for me there is a little bit of a tension in hosting these events, because in a way I am giving in that people value the literature, and by hosting events that are seeking inspiration from the literature, we are sort of gaining a crowd that respects that and are interested in the dances that, belong to that. So it's definitely a very literature-based event. We're singing the whole way through, singing ballads and singing stories, and afterwards we sing more songs and drinking songs and continue with the spoken word and lyrics and singing and even these, we call them ættjarðarlög, or songs representing the love of the motherland. A lot of them are written by Schubert, and we just have Icelandic lyrics. Maybe not a lot of them, but like 2 of them at least. But they're written by, these romantic composers of the late 19th century, but they have Icelandic lyrics, and people know them, and people sing them at functions, and they don't know that the song is by some classical composer. So we are definitely bringing the dance into popularity by navigating national romantic ideas on heritage, which is a very red flag for me personally, but it works. And it also can, I think, be a gateway, like with the hats. Suddenly people are thinking about, and I have the hat, and suddenly this mental barrier of deciding that getting into, for example, traditional clothes is too expensive. I don't know if you know how expensive the Scottish sort of full sets are.
I'd have to just take a guess at it, but they're very expensive.
Yeah,
they're hundreds of pounds, up to thousands.
Yeah, I think it's very similar, really, in Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, Scotland, Norway. I think at least when I've been comparing Greenland, Iceland, and Norway and the Faroe Islands, very compatible prices. But why can people afford it there and not here? And I think that a big part of it is the value we put into things. And of course, we don't have these social traditions of gifting young children a lot of the silver, and while you're growing up, you sort of collect the expensive things that go on it, So you have to sort of dish it all out, or not dish it out, you have to pay for it when you want it. And that can be a lot of money, It can be like a semi-cheap car. But should that really matter if it's really important to you? If it's like a part of you, you would pay, I think, anyways. I don't think that money should be a question until up to a certain mark, because what does it tell you if your national, thing or your identity is cheap? a lot of the value is in the handicraft and making it yourself and putting countless hours into sitting and working on it. And this is, I think, all of this is so intertwined, because if you want to get into the dancing, you don't have to have a costume. You don't have to perform on stage. I only do it because it helps pay for the Folk Dance Association's space. It's fundraising, essentially. I never get paid for performing for the association. And the same goes for these events with the ballad dances, that when people are starting to take this in as their identity, and we're saying it would be great if you would get a hat like this, and for the typical women's hat there is this gold or silver piece of jewelry that new costs maybe 120,000, but you can get them used for 16-20,000, and there's none on the men's hat. Or the typical traditional men's hat. But you can also skip the jewelry. But what tends to happen is that people tend to save up because they are so ready for it. And then I'm going to get this thing that's so important to me, so I want to go all the way and be really fancy and have something I like. And so there are things like this that I think are very damaging or troubling to the scene, that we have had people who are very interested in starting dancing, but they don't have a costume, and they're very afraid of the price of getting a costume, so they don't want to attend. And you talk to them and they are far down this loop of this monologue of sort of excuses and fears and made up requirements. And then they join, and in a year they have already signed up for a course and they've made their own, and suddenly, it wasn't really a matter of this, I don't know if I'm going way out of the, but it's all very connected, and it's all something that I think is very difficult to navigate. And now we have a lot of people interested in this ballad dancing, and the dance itself, if you just look at the steps and strip it away from the music and the singing, and the dance is not a complicated one. It's 2 steps to the left, 1 to the right, continuously. And we have a lot of dances that should, in theory, be much more appealing for young people and old people, that have more movement and more technique and more possibilities of flirting and sort of, communicating, that people are not drawn to because the presentation of them is that it's old people dancing it, or it's very, the music is boring, but the music is boring because people aren't really practicing it.
Right, it's like a catch-22 situation where there can't be innovation without people, but people don't want to come and innovate in it because they're put off with how it is at the moment.
Yes, and also because there hasn't been much research and publication.
Mm-hmm.
And the same goes for, I was trying to sort of talk myself into with the national costumes and the handicraft, that of course if you don't go by foreign labor and child labor, the cost of manufacture is going to go up, which is a positive thing, that you're not utilizing child labor. But then comes the question of when you're actually thinking about getting something nice for yourself and something that represents you, you don't really tend to save money when you're making these decisions. You tend to sort of, I will just save some money and try to get this thing I really want. And so I think it's a very complicated thing to enter when you don't have a lot of people who belong to it, and you don't have a big scene of people who are supportive and can talk you into it. So I at least sense a lot of negativity.
That people are focusing on these challenges more than the opportunities that the form or the scene or community allows. I
think so. But I think that the scene and the community and all of them, and I want to look at them all together because of my background. I don't do rowing or boat building or glima, traditional wrestling, although that has been present in the Folk Dance Association as well. I think that it's very positive that you can spend all your money, you can grow, you can basically do whatever you want, you can explore all of these amazing things, but we don't really have people to showcase that you can. Right. Or we have people who are showcasing it in a very, very limited way.
Give some context for that, maybe. How does that compare to, you were saying there's this tradition, or again, we're using tradition and culture and behaviour all over in these different contexts. But was it Norway, you were saying that there's a practice of giving young people or children the traditional jewellery or the elements of the traditional costume as they get older. What kind of behavioural change or practice are you looking to have here that would create the right environment for this community to thrive?
I don't know. That's the short answer. But I can definitely say that 3 or 4 years ago, I tried to hijack the... Do you know what the English word for becoming a part of the Commonwealth is? It's not independence.
No.
But, we in 1918, on the 1st of December, we had home rule. So we were still under the crown, but we had home rule. So that used to be a holiday until a few years ago. And the day is basically useless. It's still marked in the calendars, but there's nothing fancy about it. And now it's even the day of Icelandic music, which I think is ridiculous. Because why have it on the same day as one of the sort of official days of the year for the, it's stupid. It's you can keep that in even, I think it's very weird to have days that are unique to Iceland and sort of, yes, let's, we have maybe 20 days that are something here and let's like put this big thing on the same day as this other big thing. Yeah, that's great. So I had this idea of trying to celebrate that day or using that day to have the associations I belong to in Reykjavik work together, invite them to come to the Árbær Open Air Museum, and there they could sort of just, I don't really want to manage it or sort of curate it, because I think it should be more that they come and they just put on their thing and they do it themselves. And they present what they do the way they think they should do it, which is a terrible way of doing it, I found out. But it's also becoming a little bit of a fun way to do it as well.
I've had a lot of fun there. I think it's great.
And we, so I started, we were like, wear your national costumes and let's use this day to sort of embrace heritage and sort of practice it. And, the event is free and everybody's volunteering again. It's very hard to get paid doing this. And I don't know if it's connected, but then I started seeing that I think it's a rector of Tækniskólinn, they were suddenly wearing traditional costumes on this day. And I don't know if that was like something they, for some reason, decided to do, or because we were going to the radio and talking about this and how we want to sort of, it's not about the state, it's not about the nationalism, but it's like an excuse to bring focus onto this. And then they made it the day of Icelandic music, which I think that was the same day. I remember I was very offended. So I think that there has not been a culture of these things working together. In some ways, when putting performance in the National Theatre, the traditional poetry and oral performance people and the folk dancers have worked together in the past, but there hasn't really been active collaboration. And I think that all of these things can die out if they don't make sense. There's no need. They can't be in a museum if they don't make sense to be practiced. There is no need to do it like for nationalistic reasons. But if there are any other reasons to keep the conversation going, then that's a great thing. And, I think that we need to look into really unifying these different scenes and try to do that in a way where we focus on the people in the scene and not on the performers and And I think that's
You're making a distinction there because there is this dual role in a lot of these folk communities now of being a performer and a participant. And some people step more into one of those roles than the other, right?
Yes, absolutely. And, if you don't have participants or audiences, you don't really have a stage. And I think it's a little bit peculiar trying to build something by looking first at the performer and not how people are supposed to operate as audience and participants or even maneuver between. In my experience, performing artists are not very good at attending each other's events. And the people who are in the audience, I don't think it makes any sense to view them as sponsors.
No, and I think from a community-minded context, this is what we would call community, and you can take up various roles in that. I mean, even if you go back to past days and to the kind of historical context for these traditions that we look at with rose-tinted glasses, there would always have been people who did not actually dance the dances. There would have always been people who preferred to be the ones filling up the glasses or, taking care of the children and are they any less relevant as community members? I don't think so. I think, of course, you want as many people as possible for a scene to thrive, to be versed in the specific behaviour that you're looking at. But even in that there will have always been the best dancers who would have been more performative, and there would have been the people who joined in after they had done the first few steps and the focus was on them, and then you might take to the floor with your partner and kind of muddle through it. There would have always been variations of skill level and engagement. So I think you're totally spot on with this interpretation of needing a wider community context around any kind of cultural activity.
Absolutely. And then the first challenge is to convince the existing scene that this needs to happen. The second challenge is convincing people who don't know about it to give it a chance, or trying to sort of figure out how you can plant seeds, that might blossom into something. And then the third challenge is, the people come, and then what?
Right.
And is it going to be a welcoming environment? It can't be welcoming, but extremely boring. Or is it going to be welcoming, exciting, but not something for them, which is fine, so you have to try again with somebody else. But like I said, I believe that the current ways most of these associations are operating aren't working. And we see that the average median age has been growing older steadily. And, I was reading articles in the Accordion magazine from 1990, and they were like, we have to start thinking about finding new people, because without that we can't, this will never, become a self-sustainable thing. And I don't think the scene has grown by 20% since 1990. Maybe, but I doubt. And looking at all of these pictures of events through the past, 40 years, 50 years, it's all the same faces. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are missing now, but, I recognize almost everybody, and those I don't recognize are most likely dead. And those scenes in societies that are very good at getting new people in, they talk about how hard it is to get new people to volunteer, or to get new people to do some work and try to keep this, keep making it make sense. And then the challenge is, how do you respond to that without alienating the people who have been holding it up for the past decades?
Yes, like you said, you don't want to create this divide where there's something for the previous consistent membership and then something new for a kind of, I don't know, all singing, all dancing, to be really crude about it. Like it has to be, there has to be a through line for it to be the same community.
Absolutely. And that is I think the big challenge. And I mean, I'm sure that this happens in every scene, but I don't think many scenes are fortunate enough to be working with an over 100 years history. Maybe some of the sports associations, but I think that's also a bit different. There is, first of all, a lot of money involved. And there is to some extent, a culture for volunteering, especially when it comes to parents supporting their children and their participation in a sport. And the value of sports is also not questioned. Or at least not like, why the hell are you dancing folk dances? Nobody's saying, why in the world would you be practicing football? What is wrong with you? That's such a nobody would say this.
That's a really relevant comparison, I think, because it's not like everybody who plays football is playing football for the same reasons. Some people really want to be professional players, like the equivalent being like a professional dancer or performer. Some people are doing it because they want a fun social activity. Some people want the exercise. Some people are brought because that's just what their family does. There's all of these different reasons that you might participate in these things. I want to ask you something in terms of young people or anyone really who might be considering getting involved in folk dancing or another traditional activity. Sometimes there's a perception of these traditional activities that because they are handed down over generations and because they have these sort of set forms, that they lack creativity in a way that other activities don't, that there's not as many options for individual expression or ideas or innovation or creativity in general. I'm curious as to how you feel about that. Do you feel like you use creativity in your engagement with folk dancing and traditional arts, or is it a more prescriptive space and you use your creativity in other areas?
I think the whole discussion around the concept of creativity is extremely skewed. I think that we learn that creativity is this openness and, you just are creative, and creativity sparks from just nothing. And, there are creative people and there are not creative. And I don't believe in that. And I think that a part of when you are being a creative person, I think oftentimes it's because you're very accustomed to your subject. And oftentimes, you've listened to every single, heavy metal album there is. So you function in that space. Or with hip hop, you're very, very, you've listened to all of the, old artists, and you're very well, I think that the misconception here is that the scene is very small, and it takes a long time to get accustomed to the structure and the whole environment. It takes immense effort, to go deep, and there aren't really many things helping you to do it. There are people who can help you to do it, but you have to approach them as individuals. With a stronger scene in general, I think that just opens everything up for more creativity, more interpretation, more personality. There's this idea that, I'm often approached by, media especially. We're saying like, well, now you are impersonating an old-timey person. And, well, they say it in Icelandic. I'm trying to translate it. And I'm always thinking like, well, no, I am a contemporary artist here. Excuse you. And there is no way of framing it in a way they understand where I'm coming from. But they also have no idea what the subject is. They just see, that's folk dancing, that's what they did in the old days. But what I'm doing is I don't know what that looked like. It wasn't documented. I'm being handed a living tradition. I'm just reacting to that and passing it on later. And I don't know how people, how they jumped 200 years ago. I don't know how they felt the beat or how they used their bodies or how they, I don't know anything. Nobody knows. And there is this misconception that we are just sort of role-playing the past. And, I think it's absurd. I think it's sort of shows... I mean, the question you asked is excellent, but I think this attitude that is sort of hinted at in the question really shows a lack of respect towards the art form people are trying to practice. And I think that, of course, these things come to some part from a very structured society or are very structured in a way, but they also offer you sort of a box to think outside of, And it's very hard to think outside of the box when you don't have a box to think outside of. The reason I maybe answered this in such a harsh way is because this is a very, very common question. And, I was at a party the other day, and I remember this is one of the last things I remember before I sort of blacked out. I was sitting in a sofa and, this person, I'm like, wow, this person. Yeah, you didn't come with them, when they were dancing with us the other day. And I was, no, I don't like what you do there. It's very simple, too simple for me.
Wow.
And I essentially remember sort of giving this person a very weird look, and I don't know what I said. But, it's still, it's a very common thing to hear, and you're like, well, who are you? Excuse you, I've never met you, and if I haven't met you, I'm pretty sure you don't know what the hell you're talking about at this point. And I'm willing to bet that they were essentially thinking of the ballad dancing, where the steps are very simple, that's true. But I'm also willing to bet that this same person would not be able to do it and sing at the same time, because people generally don't seem to be able to do that.
It takes a while.
It takes a while, and sort of missing the point, in every way, that it's about the community, it's about the being together and moving together and singing together and sweating together and smelling the farts and the sweat and the bad breath and getting drunk. And you don't have to drink, but still you will feel the vibe and, being very warm and, sweating and, very physical and being bored together while the song goes on, past the 20th minute, and, you're waiting, is it okay if I just leave? Or, are they going to take a break after this? I need another beer, maybe a shot. Is this like a family-friendly thing? Or
No. You can talk about whatever you want.
Yeah. But I think that this is a very, very common view of people, this is not creative. And then comes the question like, well, what is creative and why is it creative? Like, is it not creative? Maybe you're doing traditional patterns, but if you're embroidering, but you have to do all of the work and it takes time. And
you are creating something.
You are creating something. And like, why, is it creative because you learned to draw something from a tutorial? And you learned the style through watching 100 tutorials and some, why is that being creative and not doing it through this idea that creativity sparks from the individual and the individual isn't inspired by anything. I think it's a ridiculous conversation, to be honest. But that's also because I've had it so many times. And I always land on the same spot. despite trying to be like, well, yeah, you're right. It's, the dance forms are very simple. They are extremely simple, some of them. But why do I know 300-400 variations then, And I don't know all of the variations. And, yeah, I don't know.
I think that's an excellent answer. And just to be very clear, I fully agree.
Yeah, I know.
I'm making you jump through hoops so that I can, get these nuances out and I think expand the conversation around these subjects because it is important. And I think people don't realise the ways in which you can be creative. I feel the same way in terms of I actually think I need more of a structure to make me creative against. You have to kind of work within or against something to find either the inspiration or the motivation or just kind of spark the idea. But I think maybe sometimes it's just about the fact that perhaps folk traditions are more honest about the way in which they gain their source material than if you're learned to become a visual artist, as you say. You're still, even these so-called naive art forms are reactions to the natural world or to other people or to everything is done in conversation. And I think to that end, I know that we could talk forever about folk culture as we're both very passionate about it. But you've talked a lot about the challenges that these communities face. But I want to talk about the kind of unique aspects that folk traditions and communities around them might teach other communities, ways that we can learn from one another in terms of building resilience, building supportive communities. What are the kind of the opportunities there to learn from the way that these communities operate?
On the individual level, there is one thing I always try to sort of mention, and I never get it right. I always listen or read what I said, and what the hell was I trying? So I think a very strong thought experiment that you sort of have to go through is that the reason we have these traditions are because the individual isn't important. And he is important as a person of a group. They can be inspiring. They can be sort of tradition bearers, and they can be, notable people. But everybody who is going to take the tradition forwards is going to be inspired, hopefully, by more people than you. So you can't be the person who wrote the poem, who wrote the song. But in general, my feeling has been that there aren't really any rock stars. There are excellent performers that can have the status of rock stars. And, the people can analyze their playing techniques. But when you look at them, they are the result of a lot of people who inspired them. And so it's very hard to be sort of the genius. You can be very knowledgeable, and you can be very talented, and you can be very inspiring. But there is a lot of value being, for example, if we put it into a concert setting, listening to a person who's playing like a violin or whatever, fiddle or whatever, and they sort of mention, well, this is a tune I learned from this person, and they were from there, where they play it in this kind of way, and I'm actually going to play it in the style of this neighboring village. And the expert is the person who is knowledgeable and has insight and is not afraid of sort of admitting that they are inspired. They are a part of a community, and this community focus is what shines so strongly through. And if I've ever had the sort of feeling of there's an imposter on the stage, that's when people don't do that. So there is no real ownership other than the society, but you can still appropriate and you can appreciate. And I also think that this is something that shines through all of the work. It doesn't have to be a stage performance. There are a lot of teachers, and then there are the entire conversations about the police. There's the folk costume police who says you can't wear it like this, you have to do it like this. And I mean, most of the times that's not the people who are really inspiring. It's the people who sort of went to a course and were told, well, people usually do it like this. They always do it like this, And I think that there are hierarchies, like there are everywhere. People have respect because of their experience, and they have respect because they have earned it. And you sort of get to know all of these people who are sharing everything they know willingly and happy to have a conversation, and they are inspiring you, and they are sort of telling you what they think. And you don't have to listen. You can do whatever you want. But these are all conversations. And after some time, you sort of start climbing the ladder of sort of being knowledgeable and having, what brilliant word did I use? Having insight. Yes, insight. Yeah, being insightful is a very valued trait. And that can also be in the administrative, having perspective and insight into how things work and how groups are working together and why this doesn't work and why we should sort of look into the past and try to learn from what we did like 50 years ago, which is a luxury. It's definitely a luxury to be able to do that. And I think that this focus on the group rather than the individual is a strength, but there is still plenty of space for the individual to blossom and be big, as big as they need to be.
I think you can really see that from the way in which, like you say, there are no rock stars, but the people who tend to be remembered or thought of fondly, whether or not they're with us or not, are their big personalities. Mm-hmm. It's someone who was quirky in some way or did things in a specific way, and we remember them very much for who they are and how they went about doing these things. And like you say, there's also this respect for the knowledge and the way that it's passed on. But it's not about being the best singer or the best dancer or the person who kept all of their knowledge to themselves. It's always about being your fully realized self in the context of a community.
Absolutely. And, there are so many elements that I think are positive, but I think this is one of the biggest positivities. But this is also something I sense is not a very popular value to have, if you can speak about values in that sort of way. And I also think that there are ways of making competitions, and so you can sort of compete and be rewarded for excellence. But what I think is so interesting, for example, in the Norwegian context, if I understand it correctly, is that, you, for example, would compete in a dance style or a playing style from this region, and you would have a panel of judges. And the judges would pass their judgment on you. But then you, sort of in my head, the judges would be older people who have had experience. So you're essentially sort of proving to them that you understand where they come from. And you can, so I don't think you would necessarily compete with a sort of, you wouldn't maybe compete in a way that sort of shakes the boat. You would compete sort of showing that you understand and understand the techniques and the values presented today. You don't even have to agree with them. But that also gives you such a great box to work with. So I think that, even in a setting where the elders are passing judgment on the new generation, I even think that it can be positive.
Because it's still a dialogue, it's a conversation.
Absolutely. And I think that this is what should be looked at as a positive thing. And also, by entering the scene, people's strengths are valued. And it isn't really a difficult thing to sort of move up. But you will get more pressure and more projects, and people burn out. These kinds of things eat you alive. They really do. And, you just have to burn stronger than the, thing you're working with. And, I have met with many fantastic people who have had sort of jobs I now have, and they have said this, I used to do this 20 years ago, but this eats you alive, And so what I'm trying to say is that there is space for everybody, and it's not very hard to make a space for yourself either. But the challenging thing is how to do it respectfully and how to do it while being well received. And I think that is the hardest thing for people to do, especially when these things tend to be very face-to-face. You can't really hide behind, posting on Instagram and sort of making statements on Twitter, because these things aren't generally there yet, I think. And many people are trying to bring this into the sort of pop culture space, me being one of them in a way, poorly, but still, at least some social media presence. But is that a good thing? Given all of the things I said earlier about, responding to not being, in social media, and
we'll just have to see, I guess.
Yeah.
Very last question. What is your hope for the future of folk dancing in Iceland, and for the community that it currently has, and for future generations to come?
I look in some ways at myself like a workhorse. I just walk. I don't really think too much about what lies ahead.
That's one of the reasons why I'm asking you this question, actually, because I think there are very many people who are involved in community endeavours like you say, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of volunteering. It's a lot of, I mean, how many committees or boards or societies are you part of? I mean, it's way up there, right?
The boards and committees are almost 20.
Yeah. At some point, it is important for us as community members to evaluate as well and to look at where we are, where we've come from, and where we'd like to go. So I'm not expecting a perfect answer, but I do think it's important to ask you.
Oh, thank you. I think that a lot of the sort of tasks I've been lining up have sort of answered this already. That I think it's very important that there exists a scene that is diverse, both in topics and representation of groups and people. I think that it's very important for these conversations that have been happening in some cases for over 100 years, and in some cases even very much longer than that, if relevant, that they keep happening. When people keep inventing the wheel and going on the radio and posting in newspapers announcing how they invented the wheel, and then you can find a YouTube video of somebody doing it 50 years ago, it irritates me immensely. So I think that it's important that the consciousness, the sort of self-awareness and the conversation will keep going. I'm very focused on these associations as institutions because they are this slow-moving wheel that reacts slowly, naturally, and then the individuals and the people work faster, and then time will sort of catch up, and so every change is a slow change. So I think that it's important that the relevant changes are made, and in a timely manner as well. There are many things that are very hard to deal with. For example, one thing that is luckily not very present is this idea that a man has to dance with a woman. It's maybe 7 years when I last encountered a problem with that happening here in Iceland, when I had to step in. But I think that it's important that, sustainability and the conversation and a healthy scene happens. And if these things continue to make sense, I think it's important that they continue to grow and that they grow in a way where we don't have this situation happen again where for example, in the Folk Dance Association, the performance group and the group of people who were keeping it alive were maybe, 150 people, and it goes down to 7, and having to rebuild from 7 people up to sort of what is a sustainable crowd, maybe 100. I don't think it's sustainable for it to come in waves so drastic. So I think that a lot of things need to happen, and also I hope that the state will try to figure out a system to support these associations in a way where it's not unfair, but it's also accessible, so they can get the support they need, be it financial or in any other way. So there are a lot of things I think need to happen, and there need to be, we need volunteers. It's not possible to uphold these topics or contexts with everybody getting paid a full salary. And if that's what's more important than these things existing, then, of course they won't exist, and then that's that, there is no way around that.
Lots to do.
Yes.
But also a great case for positivity for the future. And I think thanks to people like you, that kind of work is well on its way. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'll put links to some of the stuff that you're up to in the show notes. And if anyone wants to come along and have a dance, I highly encourage them to.
Thank you.